In this lecture, we'll explore the question, what sort of literary tools did the sage craftsman use? And by sage here, we're referring to the individuals contributing wisdom books, in particular Proverbs, but not exclusively the book of Proverbs. Here are the topics that we'll be looking at. Various tools of Hebrew poetry. The size of wisdom compositions, whether short or long. Some of the types of short wisdom sayings. The shape that longer wisdom poems can take. Some of the content that is rather unique to the longer poems. The question of length relative to date of composition. And finally, looking at some of Jesus' teachings through the lens of an awareness of wisdom forms. Let's begin then with the tools of Hebrew poetry. We'll be exploring 4 different features: parallelism, kola structure, assonance, and imagery. First, parallelism. Parallelism may be synonymous. And here is an example from chapter 16. If you follow the color coding, you can see the similar words. Honest scales and balances are from the Lord. All the weights in the bag are of His making. Honest scales and all the weights are similar. The reference to the Lord and the pronominal reference His are also synonymous. Here's another synonymously parallel proverb. Pride is parallel to haughty spirit. Destruction parallel to fall. Not all parallelism is synonymous. Some is antithetical. Here's an example from chapter 12. Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Notice that the second half of the verse provides contrasting information. Here's another antithetical. Thirdly, under parallelism, some verses are neither synonymous nor antithetical, but seem rather by their second portion to expand the information provided in the first. We call these synthetic. Chapter 15 offers an example. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, and then we might interpolate, and furthermore, or in addition to this information, here's what may be supplied. These eyes of the Lord keep watch on the evil and the good. The second portion of this verse does not simply state the same thing as the first, else it would be synonymous. It does not state something of the opposite, which would be antithetical, but rather it expands on what we find in the first. Here's one more that would be rendered synthetic. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul, healing to the bones. Some parallelisms are comparative, signaled by the use of words such as like. Like the coolness of snow at harvest time, is a trustworthy messenger to those who send him. He refreshes the spirit of his masters. Like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to those who send him. And now let's talk about kola structure. Some verses, such as verse 7 of chapter 10, consist of 2 parts, and we've seen this in some previous examples. We call this a bi-kola structure. The first colon reads, "The memory of the righteous is a blessing." The second colon reads, "But the name of the wicked will rot." This is bi-kola because it consists of 2 kola, or 2 stikoi, sometimes referred to as 2 half verses. Sometimes instead of 2, however, we find 3 kola, or a tristic verse, 3 stitches. Chapter 25:13 offers us a good example. Notice the 3 parts in one verse. Like the coolness of snow at harvest time, is a trustworthy messenger to those who send him. He refreshes the spirit of his masters. Go ahead and read this other example from verse 34 of chapter 8. Once again, notice that there are 3 parts to this verse. 3 kola. It is called a tricola or tristic verse. Occasionally we find 4 kola or 4 stikoi, 4 stitches. Chapter 19, verse 7 offers an example with 4 parts. We might ask, what significance may there be when a verse extends beyond simply 2 parts of bicola? When it extends beyond just 2 parts to a tristic or tricola verse, particularly when this occurs within a wisdom poem, that is to say, a composition which is obviously comprised of several verses running together, rather than individual atomistic sayings without obvious connection. But when it's part of an extended poem, and there we encounter either a tristic or perhaps a quatrain, we should there sense that there may be particular emphasis being made by the poet by virtue of lengthening that particular part of the composition, that verse. Here's a question to consider. Consider this particular verse, verse 19 of chapter 13, "A longing fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but fools detest turning from evil." Do you have any suggestions as to why colon B has been connected with colon A? Why are these in the same verse? At the surface level, they do not seem to be connected. The answer to this, at least in part, is a poetic device employed by the sages from time to time: assonance, similarity of sound. Unfortunately, this is part of the portion of the composition which does not pass well through the translation grid into a second language. So we must revert to the Hebrew in order to take advantage of this. Notice the sound of the words that are coded in green. A longing, and that is the Hebrew word ta'avah. A longing fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but fools detest, and this is pronounced to'avat, v'to'avat. Fools detest turning from evil. So it's entirely possible that the sage was connecting colon A with colon B based on the linkage of an assonantal sort. One of the features that we encounter within wisdom composition from time to time is the use of concrete imagery. Concrete imagery. Many of the concepts that the sages are trying to transmit are fairly abstract, and it's always a good idea for and an indication of an effective communicator when they bridge the abstract by use of something concrete in order to make it easier for the audience to get hold of the idea. Notice these examples: first simile and then metaphor. The abstract concept here is the notion of setting oneself free. The larger context will show us that it's setting oneself free from a foolish contract which a person has engaged. They've made a commitment and it was a foolish one, and now the sage says you need to free yourself from that. Free yourself like a gazelle, and there is our simile, from the hand of a hunter. And now a second simile, like a bird from the snare of the fowler. By use of this concrete imagery, it would help, in this case, the youth, the audience of chapter 6 in Proverbs, to better appreciate what a dire distress he is in by virtue of having engaged a foolish contract. And here's another from that same chapter. The line of reasoning goes, if you fail to extricate yourself from this foolish contract, then poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. This will be the result of indolence, not getting up and getting going, in particular, extricating yourself from this bad contract. A simile used to clarify the danger that is surrounding the audience. Another simile in chapter 26. And now a metaphor. These commandments are a lamp. They constitute a lamp, a source of illumination. So concrete imagery was employed by the sage to help abstract concepts become easier for the audience to appreciate. Let's turn now to the topic of short compositions and long compositions within wisdom literature. We find both short compositions, little sayings, and we find short compositions that are admonitions. We also want to be aware of the fact that within wisdom composition, and particularly Proverbs, for example, we also encounter long wisdom poems. First, then, short compositions, and these may be either sayings or admonitions. Sayings are indicative in their mood, that is, they describe a situation without issuing a command. As indicated earlier, in contrast, admonitions are imperative. They issue a command. Occasionally, short sayings can appear within the longer wisdom poems, but most typically we find these shorter sayings outside the wisdom poems. What are some of the general characteristics of these pithy, short sayings? And I'm indebted to J.G. Williams' comments that Roland Murphy captured in his volume Tree of Life for the first 4 of these. Here's a sample, and then we'll give you the characteristic following it. Lazy hands make a man poor. So it's been observed that these short, pithy sayings are often very assertive. They punch through with a truth. How about this from Proverbs 13? Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. We notice here that pithy sayings provide insight concerning the conduct of one's life. Incidentally, it's just coincidental that this verse contains the word life, and we're observing that short sayings provide insights about life. That is not a necessary connection. In chapter 25, we read that a soft tongue breaks the bone. And here it's been observed that pithy sayings often register the opposite of what one would expect. Whoever thought that a soft organ such as the tongue could have the crushing effect of breaking a hard object such as a bone? This is not what we would expect. Pithy sayings frequently set up these surprising, these paradoxical situations in order to capture our attention. They require us then to reflect further, and then we can see the truth of it. A fourth feature is couched in this from Proverbs 11. When pride comes, then comes disgrace. And here we'd like to draw your attention to the brevity, the concision of expression here. Few words, as Williams puts it. The point is a maximum of meaning in a minimum of words. Proverbs, not only Hebrew, but in other languages as well, typically are simmered for a long time before they reach their final stage. That is to say, they're carefully crafted and use a minimum of words to convey a maximum of meaning. From Proverbs 13, this observation: Proverbs may be imperative even without issuing a command. A saying may be imperative by implication. He who scorns instruction will pay for it, but he who respects a command is rewarded. No imperative is included within this verse, but it's not difficult to extract from it what the sage hopes we will do. He hopes that we will not scorn instruction, but that in fact we will respect a command. So the undercurrent instruction, the undercurrent imperative would read, don't scorn an instruction, but do respect a command. In technical terms, this is a saying, that is to say, it contains no explicit imperative, But let's not miss the point that even sayings have undercurrent expectations or hopes for behavior, undercurrent imperatives. Let's turn our attention now to what shape these short wisdom sayings may take. What are some of the characteristic forms of them? There's a form that's come to be called the better sayings, and they issue a comparative evaluation from item A to item B. Very easy to recognize because they will literally have the word better contained within them. So from Proverbs 16, better a patient man, and here's the second comparative feature, than a warrior. And then by ellipsis carried over, better a man who controls his temper than one who takes a city. Another example would be found in chapter 17, verse 1 and verse 12. Another form which we find the sages employing for their wisdom sayings was a form which we might call the blessed or the happy sayings. And here we need to clarify that the Hebrew used is ashrei, which means ultimately prosperous, having achieved the best in life. This is not the same as another Hebrew word, unfortunately, often translated blessed, which is baruch, and this is more the technical meaning of kneeling to bless or receiving a blessing from someone, that is a good saying from someone in oftentimes a superior position, such as being blessed by God. When we encounter these blessed or happy sayings, we should recognize them as pointing out to us an evaluation in the Proverbs, in the sages' system of value, an evaluation of some quality which the sage holds to have singular and supremely high value. Let's look at an example. Blessed, that is to say, ultimately prosperous, is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding. Another from chapter 28. Blessed, that is, ultimately prosperous, is the man who always fears the Lord, but he who hardens his heart falls into trouble. Another form that we find the sages using may be called the character summary. Where a character summary typically occurs is at the close of a wisdom poem. A longer composition, reaching the close, the sage wraps it up with a summary which typically compares two characters. And so we find toward the close of the poem, ending in chapter 1, verse 19, such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. That is the character that the sage is wanting us to focus on, and he's saying, here's, in short, how these characters, these individuals, those who chase after wealth, profit, but they do it without a moral compass. What happens to them eventually? It will take away their lives. This situation contains only one character. It's not comparing two, just one. In contrast, this example from later in the same chapter, we find more than one character compared. For the waywardness of the simple will kill them, complacency of fools will destroy them, but whoever listens, or we might read it more woodenly, whoever is a listener to me will live in safety and be at ease, without fear of harm. If we were to review this entire poem in Proverbs 1, we would see that the simple and fools appeared earlier. And then when we come to the end, this new character, a listener, is introduced, and the sage cleverly concludes by compressing these characters together and giving us a summary statement, favoring some and showing disregard for others. Here's another form used by the sages, the use of questions, and usually it will be rhetorical questions. Listen to how these questions cause us to stop and reflect. Can a man scoop fire into his lap? without his clothes being burned? Well, certainly we would say no, that's impossible. Context of this one is indicating how hazardous and unwise it is for a person to be involved in adultery. Here's a reflective question, one that we might expect to encounter in the Psalms, or perhaps in a prophet writing in Jeremiah or Isaiah. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from sin? From the same chapter, chapter 20. A man's steps are directed by the Lord. How then can anyone understand his own way? The use of rhetorical questions as a form for wisdom sayings. Some of the sayings that we encounter give us the notion, either explicitly or implicitly, that they belong to a royal court environment. These have come to be called royal proverbs. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, not for kings to drink wine, nor for rulers to crave beer. And this caution goes on to say, if they do so, they may lose a critical faculty of judgment, being able to render fair decisions, something that a king was responsible to do in the ancient world. These also would qualify as royal proverbs. Take a moment to read them over. In addition to these sayings, which are short, we also have admonitions. Admonitions include the imperative mood, a command. Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. This is an exhortation to come to the aid of someone who is being unfairly treated, and frankly, he is in mortal peril. Such would be a positive command. Some other commands are prohibitions. They are negative. Do not withhold good from those who deserve it. So we might recap these tools of Hebrew poetry, operating often in parallel structure, whether it be 2 cola, 3 cola, 4 a quatrain, employing assonance sometimes to link together the first part of a verse with the second, appealing to imagery so that abstract concepts will be more easily appreciated by the audience. The short proverbs sometimes are indicative without an explicit command. We call them sayings. Others of them are admonitions, which are classed so simply by virtue of the fact that they contain an explicit command, an imperative. Now we turn to longer compositions, the wisdom poem. We want to be aware that these predominantly in the book of Proverbs appear in chapters 1 through 9. And here you see a few titles of these. Even outside chapters 1 through 9, there appear some connected compositions. And here you see several samples. Proverbs is not the only book that contains longer wisdom compositions. Job, for example, has several, as does Ecclesiastes. Even within these longer compositions, periodically we find embedded short sayings. One occurs in chapter 1. We can find another in chapter 31. Once again, the idea here is that even within a longer composition, at times the sage, the composer of the longer wisdom poem, will say, here's a point where a pithy short saying would serve my longer poem and help impact the audience with its message. And so he reaches, as it were, to the tool bench, draws out one little pearl of wisdom and injects it into the larger poem, and there it lodges a brief saying within a longer composition. Some of the forms which operate in longer compositions, by virtue of their length, allow these to happen, which would not happen within a shorter saying, are the following. A palistrophic pattern that is an extended chiasm. Chiasm that is an inversion of order of parts. So this would take the structural pattern of A, B, C, and then reversing order, C prime, B prime, A prime, so that content A and A prime have some similarity, B and B prime have similarity, C and C prime have similarity, but they're operating in inverse order, A, B, C, and then backing out, C prime, B prime, A prime. This would be a palistrophic pattern, extended chiasm. Too complex to operate in a short saying, but we find the sages using this very sophisticated structure from time to time within the longer poems. You can find a couple of these actually in chapter 1 of Proverbs. We also find the sages employing an acrostic poem where the first letter of a verse will spell out something else. Typically it will spell out the alphabet. An inclusio may also be used in a longer wisdom composition. Inclusio refers to the beginning and the ending having some degree of similarity. Longer compositions also may employ the numerical saying, 3 things, yea 4, 2 things, yea 3. This sort of numerical itemization of similar components. These appear particularly in Proverbs chapter 30. In this particular lecture, we won't take time to illustrate all these, but that gives you an idea of some of the features which can occur within longer wisdom poems. Next, let's consider content that's unique to the longer compositions. There are a couple of items worth observing here. The first is that within longer compositions, periodically the sage will appeal to autobiographical, anecdotal, eyewitness material. Here's an example from chapter 4. When I was a boy in my father's house, this is autobiographical. As to content, another feature unique to the longer material, we find actually a prayer within Proverbs. This is unusual. Within Proverbs, typically they're giving general advice about life. They don't stop and issue a prayer. But in chapter 30, we find a prayer. This is within the Agur material. Regarding the historical development of Proverbs, it's been suggested that the shorter came first and then the longer. The pithy sayings came first and then the longer compositions were much later. Over against this hypothesis, it's worth being aware that from the Nile culture we have evidence from a document known as the Wisdom of Ptahhotep. Who was Ptahhotep? He was the vizier, the prime minister to Egyptian king Izizi, 5th dynasty, which you see was very early, 2450 BC. Even a copy that we have dates as early as 1900 BC. And in the composition style of this early document, we find people capable of writing lengthy wisdom poetry, not just pithy sayings, but lengthy wisdom poetry, far in advance of, for example, the Solomonic monarchy in Israel, which we would date to somewhere in the 10th century BC. Some 900 years or to 1,000 years prior, we have an Egyptian wisdom composition with long poems. Consequently, it's not necessary to suppose that long wisdom poems must be very late in the history of Israelite composition of wisdom literature. Finally, we want to take our awareness of these various wisdom forms and through this lens read some of Jesus' teachings. Notice, for example, this from Matthew 18. But if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck. Jesus used better to signal a condition which normally would not be considered desirable. Blessed, from the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. Similar to the use of better in that previous teaching, here blessed signals a condition not normally considered desirable, as if to say, you wouldn't normally expect this, but actually, it's a good thing to be poor in spirit. You're achieving a life of ultimate worthwhile living, prosperity, or benefit if you are among those who mourn or are meek or who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Most are aware of Jesus' frequent use of parables, a wisdom form. In Matthew 13, the Gospel writer summarizes Jesus' use of this form, and you see below that the Gospel writer is reminded of a passage in Psalms, which refers to the use of parables and hidden things. So let's recap what we've seen in this lecture. A variety of tools employed for Hebrew poetry, including parallelism, various forms of colostructure, assonance, concrete imagery. We've seen that some parables are very short and some extend into long wisdom poems. The short, whether indicative or imperative, and the long, as we've indicated, comprise entire wisdom poems. The short sayings may be characterized by a variety of forms: blessed, better, summarizing character, issuing a question, often rhetorical, and oftentimes giving us the notion that either implicitly or explicitly this content is at home within a royal setting. When it comes to the longer poems, we became aware that there are some forms which are uniquely able to be used in the longer poems: palistrophe, acrostic, inclusio, numerical sayings. Within the longer poems, some specialized content which periodically will occur will be an autobiographical viewpoint, the poet speaking first person, and very occasionally even a prayer, occasionally within Proverbs itself. Over in Job, we do find prayer as well, where Job himself will be addressing God. As to length and dating, it's not necessary for the longer material to be consigned to a later date, as we saw from the evidence from the Nile culture. And finally, we observed that Jesus, as teacher, employed wisdom forms to help his communication better penetrate the audience he was endeavoring to reach. One piece by way of conclusion, then, is to observe that from this discussion of literary devices, we can see the sages were literarily gifted. This was true not only for Israelite sages, but for Egyptian as well. Part of this giftedness is evident from the fact that they employed a wide variety of forms and ventured into a wide variety of content. And so we may extrapolate from this model that for pastors and teachers today seeking to communicate from God's Word, how important it is to employ whatever degree of skill we have to shape and cast that Word, so that, as is said of the writer of Ecclesiastes, one of the wisdom books, we find in the epilogue this evaluation: the teacher, that is, the writer of Ecclesiastes, was very wise and taught the people what he knew. He very carefully thought about, studied, and set in order many wise teachings. The teacher looked for just the right words to write what was dependable and true. Or, I like how New Living Bible puts it, indeed the teacher taught the plain truth, and he did so in an interesting way. May this characterize our teaching as well.